When I arrived at my sister's engagement party, the security guard didn't even look me in the eye before pointing me toward the service entrance. My own sister stood 10 feet away, pretending she didn't know me too, afraid her perfect new family might see the brother she'd spent years hiding. What none of them knew was this: the door they forced me through led straight into the hotel I owned. And before the night was over, the groom's family, so polished, so proud, so desperate to impress, would discover that every lie they'd told, every secret they'd buried, and every cruel assumption they'd made about me was about to come crashing down in the most brutal way. I walked through that service hallway with a tattered hoodie on my back and a truth sharp enough to split the night wide open. My name is Rylan, and tonight, I need you with me. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here listening. Just type hi in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes even the smallest connection can make a heavy memory easier to carry. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. And if this kind of story makes you feel something, anger, sympathy, even just curiosity, please consider subscribing. It helps me keep sharing the moments I once thought I'd never speak about. When I arrived at the Blue Monarch Savannah that afternoon, I stepped out of my truck feeling like a stranger walking into a life I had built with my own hands. The hotel's glass facade shimmered in the Georgia light, reflecting a version of myself I didn't quite recognize anymore. I tugged the sleeves of my worn hoodie over my wrists, brushed the dust from my faded jeans, and reminded myself that disappearing into the background was the entire point. I wanted to see everything from the ground level, not from the presidency suite upstairs where my name quietly lived on every document and deed. But the moment I approached the main entrance, Officer Grant stepped in front of me. He looked me up and down with that familiar American way of sorting people into categories without saying a word. "Service entrance is on the side," he said, already dismissing me. I told him I was here for the Creed Whitmore engagement party. He frowned as if the combination of those words coming out of me didn't make sense. "Then you definitely want the service entrance." I hesitated. One sentence, just a handful of words, could have ended this entire misunderstanding. I could have told him he was speaking to the owner of the hotel he was guarding. But before I could make that choice, the doors behind him opened, and Harper stepped out. My sister. Perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect timing. She walked alongside the wedding planner and the groom's mother, 3 silhouettes of curated elegance. I raised a hand, hoping for even a flicker of recognition. Harper glanced my way, then quickly away, her expression tightening the moment Officer Grant said, "Delivery staff gets mixed up all the time." She didn't correct him. She didn't defend me. She didn't even look embarrassed. She just let the lie settle comfortably between us to protect her own image. It was the 3rd time in my life I'd watched Harper choose appearance over truth, and somehow it still stung. So I swallowed the instinct to reveal who I was, forced a neutral smile, and walked toward the service entrance like I belonged there. The hallway smelled like bleach and last night's trash. Cold air seeped through the concrete, slipping under my skin. It reminded me of quieter wounds, nights I paid our mother's medical bills alone while Harper convinced herself I was drifting, lost, irresponsible. Back then, I never corrected her either. I'm not sure why. Maybe I didn't want to change the story in her head if she needed it to feel like her world made sense. I reached the end of the hallway and pushed open the metal door into the kitchen. Heat slammed into me. Pans clattered, knives chopped, steam billowed. Within seconds, someone shoved an apron into my chest. "You're late," a prep cook barked before running off. Chef Laurent didn't even look up before pointing at a mountain of shrimp waiting to be peeled. And just like that, I became part of the staff. No one here knew I owned the hotel they were sweating in. No one knew that the same sister who had just pretended not to see me would soon learn how much that silence cost her. I tied the apron around my waist and stepped into the chaos, reminding myself the truth always arrives whether people are ready for it or not. The kitchen felt like another world, louder, hotter, more honest than anything happening upstairs. I stood at the prep table peeling shrimp under the sharp supervision of Chef Laurent, who assumed I was the replacement they'd been begging staffing to send. I didn't correct him. There was something grounding about being just another pair of hands, unnoticed, unimportant, free to listen. And the staff talked. God, did they talk. In between orders, they whispered stories about Harper, how she'd changed the menu 12 times because the shade of the garnish didn't photograph well, how she fired 3 servers for bringing the wrong color floral arrangements into the ballroom, how one girl had locked herself in the walk-in freezer after being yelled at for smudging a charger plate. Each word felt like another quiet cut deeper than the last. I kept peeling shrimp, trying not to let the anger bubble over, but then I heard something that made my hands still. 2 line cooks whispering near the dishwasher said Harper had told the Whitmores I was nothing more than a freelance tech guy with unstable income. She's scared they'll judge her for having a broke brother, one of them said. Old money folks are brutal about that stuff. It hit me harder than I expected. I had always known Harper cared too much about appearances, but erasing my success entirely. Selling a version of me that wasn't true, that was new, and it hurt. Chef Laurent soon sent me downstairs to retrieve a specific vintage from the wine cellar. The basement was cooler, quieter, and the staff down there had their own opinions. They laughed about how the Whitmores complained the hotel's best champagne wasn't East Coast elegant, how Margot Whitmore made pointed comments about how Savannah lacked real refinement. They said it like it was just workplace gossip, but I felt each word pressed against my ribs. My hotel. My home. Built from the ground up and dismissed like it was second-rate. And then came the second twist. A young server approached me breathless and wide-eyed. She recognized my last name on the guest list earlier and whispered that Margot Whitmore had secretly met with the ballroom manager to request a credit check on my family, and that Harper had allowed it without objection. I stood there in the dim cellar holding a bottle of wine I suddenly couldn't feel in my hands. My sister hadn't just erased my success. She'd opened the door for strangers to dissect my life like it was a liability she needed to manage. By the time I returned to the kitchen, something in me had shifted. I finished the tasks assigned to me mechanically, listening to the kitchen clatter around me. But my mind was already upstairs. Eventually, I slipped away and stepped into the service elevator. The ride up felt impossibly slow. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, the hallway was silent, polished, untouched by the chaos below. No one down there knew what waited at the top of this building. No one knew the key card in my pocket would unlock the office that controlled everything. I pressed my thumb to the biometric lock and the door clicked open. For the first time all evening, I let the truth breathe. Because if Harper wanted a version of me small enough to hide, she was about to learn that some truths are too big to bury. From the window of my executive office, Savannah stretched out beneath the dying light like a city holding its breath. The river shimmered gold, the breeze drifted soft across the rooftops, and for a moment the world felt impossibly calm. That stillness clashed so violently with the chaos I knew was unfolding floors below that it almost felt surreal. Up here in the quiet, I slipped back into the version of myself most people never saw, measured, focused, in control. I logged into the hotel's internal system, my fingers moving out of habit, and pulled up the ballroom cameras. Dozens of angles blinked onto the screens. It didn't take long to find what I suspected. Near the rear entrance of the ballroom, Margot Whitmore leaned in close to one of the audio technicians. Her smile was sharp, rehearsed, the kind delivered by someone who understood how to weaponize charm. She pressed a small USB into his palm and tapped his wrist twice, as if signing a secret deal. He nodded and tucked it into his pocket. I watched her gesture to the stage, making a circling motion that seemed to mark timing. Whatever she had planned was meant to happen when Harper spoke. I switched cameras. More angles. And then something made my breath catch. On another screen, Harper stepped away from her table, heading toward the restroom. The moment she disappeared from view, Margot reached across the chair, opened Harper's purse without hesitation, and pulled out her wallet. She snapped photos of her credit cards and ID, as if this were routine, no guilt, no hesitation. I felt heat rise in my chest, not anger yet, but something sharper, colder. Something that tightened behind my ribs. Before I could process it, my phone buzzed. A message from Elliot, my general manager. Check from the Whitmore account flagged. Possible issue. Need guidance. I told him not to act yet. Not until I was ready. After that, I called the head of security and ordered a full backup of every minute of footage from the past 12 hours. No deletions. No alterations. No exceptions. I knew better than anyone how quickly people tried to rewrite their sins. I left the office and headed to the audio control room. The hum of machinery filled the narrow space monitors glowing with timelines and cue lists. I scrolled until I found the scheduled playback during Harper's speech. A file with a strange name sat in the slot where a musical interlude should have been. It wasn't labeled as anything obvious, just an odd arrangement of letters. My stomach tightened. Someone wanted it hidden in plain sight. I ran a system trace. The file had been uploaded using a device connected earlier in the week, and not in Savannah. The same USB had been plugged into 2 other Blue Monarch properties in the days leading up to the party. That meant preparation, coordination, intent. I stood there in the dim blue light of the control room, the weight of everything settling onto my shoulders. Whatever was happening tonight wasn't spontaneous. It was crafted, rehearsed, and aimed directly at Harper. I shut down the terminal and stared at my reflection in the darkened monitor. The hoodie, the apron still tied around my waist. The hands of a man everyone assumed was expendable. For now, that worked in my favor. I stepped out into the hallway and untied the apron only long enough to retie it tighter. Then I headed back toward the service elevator. Let them underestimate me. Let them believe I was invisible. That kind of blindness always came with consequences. As the elevator doors closed, I reminded myself that truth has a way of pushing itself to the surface. It didn't need me to shout. It only needed me to be patient. When I stepped back into the ballroom, the noise hit me first, a layered mix of laughter, clinking glasses, and the thin strain of a violin quartet trying its best to compete with human vanity. I lifted a tray of champagne flutes and moved through the crowd with the same anonymity I'd worn all night. It was astonishing how easily people revealed themselves when they believed you existed only to hold a tray. From the center of the room, I saw Harper, surrounded, smiling, performing. Her posture was stiff in a way only I would recognize the stiffness of someone trying too hard to appear effortless. The Whitmore relatives circled her like evaluators rather than future family. I stepped closer, just close enough to hear her speak. "My brother couldn't make it tonight," she said lightly. "He's brilliant really, but simple at heart. These high-end events aren't exactly his world." A few people chuckled. Someone murmured, "Understandable." Another added, "Not everyone is made for this kind of environment." My chest tightened. I didn't approach her. I didn't correct her. Not yet. Instead, I moved away, letting her words settle in a place that hurt more than I expected. Behind the ballroom at the service station, Chase Whitmore intercepted me with the swagger of someone who'd never been challenged in his life. He blocked my path, smirking. "You working all night? Or you looking to make some easy cash?" He slid a bill into my pocket. His tone, his posture, the way he looked at me like I couldn't possibly have ambition or dignity, it all went into a quiet archive in my mind. I didn't react. Later would come. I returned to the ballroom and slipped beside a pair of Whitmore cousins, whispering near a column. "If Harper signs off on it, the land deal goes through," one said. "We just need her convinced this marriage gives her leverage." The other nodded. "Her brother's an afterthought. She'll handle him." My grip tightened around the tray. They weren't just looking for money. They wanted access to the riverfront property I owned, the one Harper believed belonged to the family at large. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about status. It was acquisition disguised as matrimony. I headed straight back to the audio control room. I needed answers. Needed confirmation of what that USB contained. When I accessed the folder again, I played a few seconds of the file before stopping it cold. It was Harper's voice, but not as she would ever speak. Spliced, rearranged, manipulated. Designed to humiliate her at the peak of the evening. Designed to make her look ungrateful and cruel. And beneath that distortion, a recording I recognized from years ago, an argument between Harper and me that never should have left the walls of our mother's apartment. Only one person had been close enough then. One person who had held her phone like a weapon. Lena. The realization drained the room of air. She'd given the Whitmores a piece of our past, something raw and private, twisting it into something that would tear Harper apart in front of everyone she'd tried so hard to impress. I shut the monitors off one by one and stood in silence for a moment. The weight of betrayal didn't hit all at once. It seeped in slowly, steady as a bruise forming beneath the skin. I walked out of the control room with a new clarity. This wasn't just about Harper's choices anymore or her desperate attempt to be accepted. This was a coordinated attempt to break her, to reshape her into something useful and discardable once they were done. And stitched into their plan was my silence, my absence. The version of me Harper had allowed them to believe. Not anymore. I adjusted the apron around my waist and headed back toward the ballroom with a steady breath and a steady mind. If truth was going to find its way to the surface tonight, then I would be the one guiding it. And I wouldn't let anyone, not the Whitmores, not Lena, not even Harper, look away from what they'd done. The message from Elliot came through just as I stepped out of the service hallway with a fresh tray of champagne. The alert banner glowed on my phone like a warning flare. The bank had returned the Whitmores' $72,000 payment. I told him to hold off on any action until I was ready. Down on the ballroom floor, the night had begun to fray at the edges. Harper was pacing between tables, her smile tightening each time Margot tapped her wrist or corrected some minute detail of the decor. I watched from a distance as Harper snapped at a floral attendant, then immediately apologized, her nerves firing in every direction. I stayed silent behind my tray, invisible by design. When she handed me her empty glass without even looking at my face, I reminded myself she had no idea who she was speaking to. No idea I was the one quietly funding the very life she was trying so hard to impress others with. Before I could retreat toward the service station, Lena appeared. She froze when she recognized me, her eyes widening with something between shock and guilt. Before either of us could speak, Margot approached, and Lena instantly pretended not to know me. Only when Margot moved on did she grab my arm and pull me into a quiet corner of the hallway. She confessed with her voice trembling that Margot had cornered her days ago, threatening to ruin her contract if she didn't provide all information about me and Harper. She claimed she never meant for things to go this far. Maybe that was true. But betrayal doesn't hurt less just because someone didn't intend the wound. I left her there and walked deeper into the hallway where Elliot stood waiting with the folder in his hands, worry etched across his face. He hated being the bearer of bad news at a formal event. I told him to wait for my signal. Timing mattered now. Back inside the ballroom, Margot floated through her circle of friends with practiced ease. I passed near enough to hear her murmur, "We're not looking for a daughter-in-law. We're looking for a financial anchor." The words stripped away any lingering doubt. Their interest in Harper had nothing to do with love and everything to do with the riverfront acreage they assumed Harper had influence over. I carried my tray toward the far wall and spotted Harper slipping into the small dressing lounge. Her shoulders were shaking. When she lifted her phone to her ear, her voice cracked. "I'm terrified they'll find out the truth about him. Him. Me." I realized then she hadn't lied only to protect her pride. She'd weaponized my image, turning me into a fictional benefactor, a badge of legitimacy she could flash in front of a family obsessed with pedigree. By the time I returned to the ballroom, guests were being guided toward their seats for the speeches. Harper took her place at the center, eyes shining with a nervous hope. She started speaking about loyalty, about family support, about how her brother had always been her anchor, her financial backbone, her guide. I stood just a few feet away, holding a tray, listening to a version of myself I didn't recognize. As she lifted her glass, Elliot entered the ballroom. He carried the folder against his chest and scanned the room. Harper straightened, preparing herself as if he were approaching her. But Elliot didn't even glance her way. He walked straight to me. The room quieted. I tightened my grip on the tray, feeling the weight of every stare. Elliot leaned forward and said just loud enough for nearby tables to hear Mr. Creed, "We have a serious problem with the Whitmore payment." And every pair of eyes turned toward us. For a long second, the ballroom froze. Guests looked from Elliot to me, then back again, trying to understand why a general manager was addressing a server as if he were a man of authority. Harper stood motionless at the edge of the stage, disbelief etched across her face. Margot's expression curdled into irritation, as though Elliot's words were an inconvenience she intended to swat away. I guided Elliot toward a quiet alcove near the back, untied my apron, and opened the folder. The check had bounced because the Whitmore account held $412. $412. That meant they had known this payment would fail long before tonight. They'd gambled that the celebration would proceed before the bank froze the rest of their assets. Elliot hesitated before sharing another piece of information. The Whitmore mortgage was tied to a development group aggressively bidding for land along the Savannah riverfront, the same land tied to my upcoming Blue Monarch project. This marriage wasn't a union. It was leverage. On my way back to the ballroom, I stepped onto the balcony where I heard raised voices. Bennett was arguing with his mother. "I'm not marrying her for money," he said, desperation scraping his tone raw. Margot snapped back, "You don't get to choose. Our survival depends on this wedding." Their words cut through the night air, confirming everything I'd pieced together. When I stepped back inside, Sophia Bennett's younger sister approached me with a quiet urgency. She told me her mother planned to humiliate Harper before the evening ended, and then handed me a printed exchange between Margot and the audio technician. The messages detailed exactly when to play the edited recording of Harper. It was a map of destruction. I thanked her and moved toward the lighting control room to confirm my suspicions. On the system display, the file had been renamed and repositioned so it would play at the height of Harper's gratitude speech. The thought of Harper standing before hundreds of people while her own voice betrayed her spliced, distorted, weaponized, tightened something deep inside my chest. As I left the control room, security radioed to alert me that someone had just requested deletion of the ballroom's camera footage, claiming it came on behalf of the hotel owner. They had no idea they were speaking about me. That single request was enough to reveal intent. Someone wasn't just planning sabotage, they were prepping to erase the evidence. I headed downstairs to the wine cellar to clear my thoughts and found Harper sitting on a crate, her makeup smudged, her breath unsteady. When she saw me, she wiped her eyes and whispered that the Whitmores had been belittling her for weeks, criticizing her manners, her posture, her wardrobe, her education. She said she felt like she was drowning in expectations she couldn't meet. When I asked why she lied about me, she looked at the floor. She admitted she had told them I was a millionaire investor, someone they would respect, someone who made her worthy by association. She said she was terrified of losing Bennett, terrified of being judged, terrified of being seen as less. I wanted to be angry. Part of me was. But another part saw the scared girl. She used to be the one who thought acceptance was something earned through performance rather than honesty. Still, fear doesn't absolve the damage done. She wasn't telling me everything. I saw it in the way she hesitated, the way her voice snagged before certain words. There was more. Much more. And the only way to bring it all to the surface was to end the night her way of living depended on. I left her there and walked toward the service elevator with a single decision burning through every step. I would let the truth rip the curtain down, not to punish her, but to free her. Tonight, in that ballroom filled with people who had mistaken silence for weakness, the truth wasn't something to avoid. It was the only way out. I walked back into the ballroom with a different kind of calm, the sort that settles in once you stop hiding and start letting the truth do its work. The chandeliers glittered overhead, casting their clean, polite light across a room full of people who had no idea how close they were to having their illusions shattered. I held the champagne tray steady against my palms, but my mind was already 5 steps ahead, moving through each moment I knew was about to unfold. Elliot spotted me from across the room and began weaving through tables as we'd arranged. When he reached the center, he lifted his voice, calling out Mr. Creed. Every conversation dropped. Every head turned. Harper's eyes found mine instantly. Shock widened them, swallowing the confidence she'd been performing all evening. I lowered the tray, accepted the folder from Elliot, and walked toward the microphone. My voice carried across the room with a steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar after the hours I'd spent pretending to be invisible. I announced that the Whitmore check had been returned due to insufficient funds. Gasps scattered across the ballroom. Margot stood abruptly, insisting it was a bank error. But a man near the front, someone from her own guest list, raised his hand and calmly explained that the Whitmore accounts were frozen pending review of multiple overdue loans. A second silence followed, heavier than the first. I let it sit before I told them who I was. Owner of Blue Monarch Hotels. Owner of the building they were standing in. Owner of the land they were trying to leverage through a marriage disguised as a union. Everything went still. Harper looked as if the ground had vanished under her feet. Bennett's mouth parted, but no sound came out. and Margot, rigid in her posture, tried to arrange her expression into dignity and failed. I tapped a key on the remote and the projector screens flickered on. The first clip showed Margot handing cash to the technician, slipping him the USB, whispering timing. The second clip showed her hand in Harper's purse, photographing her ID and credit cards, while Harper stood on the other side of the ballroom, retouching her lipstick. I let the images play long enough for their meaning to sink in. Then I opened the audio file she'd planned to use, a sliced and rearranged recording meant to humiliate Harper by making her sound arrogant, ungrateful, contemptuous. I told the room the recording had been assembled using material someone had once taken from me in private, and that the manipulated version was designed to detonate at the height of Harper's speech. A man in the corner, the family lawyer, began packing his briefcase, muttering about conflicts and liabilities before hurrying toward the exit. That was confirmation enough that he'd known exactly how deep the Whitmore problems ran. My attention went to Harper and Bennett. Bennett rose first, insisting he had no knowledge of any plot, that he wanted nothing to do with sabotage or deceit. Harper stood beside him but didn't speak. Her expression was a storm of fear, uncertainty, and dawning clarity. She was realizing the full weight of what she had allowed and what she had ignored. I turned back to the crowd and laid out the remaining evidence: the scheduled audio trigger, the transfer log showing the USB's installation, the messages requesting deletion of security footage under a false claim of hotel authorization. Elliot's phone buzzed. He leaned in to whisper that the Whitmore's fourth mortgage had just gone into pre-foreclosure status. The truth was no longer a shadow. It was the whole room. I ended my speech by saying the choice of marriage belonged to Harper alone, but that no decision made tonight or in the future should be shaped by lies told to her or through her. Then I stepped away from the microphone and let the room breathe, ready to intervene again if anyone attempted to distort what had just been shown. I moved to the edge of the ballroom where the lighting dimmed slightly, watching the ripples spread through the crowd. Conversations erupted, hushed and frantic. Margot lunged for the microphone, pointing at Harper and shouting that she had lied first, that she had misrepresented her own family, that she was the one who should be blamed. But Harper's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted everything: her shame, her fear, her decision to erase the truth about me to avoid being judged by people she desperately wanted approval from. She turned toward me and apologized, not with excuses, but with a painful honesty that shook something loose in my chest. I let myself feel the softness of that moment, but didn't offer instant absolution. Some lessons require accountability to take root. Across the room, Bennett confronted his mother. His voice rose raw with disbelief as he accused her of manipulating him, of orchestrating the marriage for profit, of using Harper's insecurities as leverage. He declared he was finished relying on family money and would build his life on his own terms. Then he faced me and apologized for doubting Harper's intentions, admitting he had sensed something was wrong but never imagined the depth of what his family had done. Before anyone could gather their breath, Sophia stepped forward. She revealed that their mother had hired a private investigator to follow Harper for 2 months, collecting every detail of her life, credit history, family dynamics, even my supposed financial worth. The room stiffened under the weight of that information. Lena approached next. She stood in front of me, trembling, and apologized for her involvement. She handed me her phone with messages showing Margot's threats and her reluctance to participate. I accepted the apology, but kept a quiet distance in my heart. Forgiveness doesn't erase the memory of being breached. When the room settled enough for me to speak, I told Harper she was the one who would decide the future of her engagement. Not the Whitmores, not their expectations, and certainly not the lies she had built to survive among them. Harper wiped her face and said she needed time, not because she doubted Bennett's feelings, but because she no longer trusted her own choices. She announced that the engagement was on hold. Then she turned to me and said she wanted to rebuild herself from the ground up, learn humility, and understand the work she had dismissed. She asked to join the hotel's internal training program. I told her she would start in housekeeping at 5 in the morning. She nodded, accepting without complaint. Security escorted Margot and her husband out. There were no protests, no attempts at saving face, just the heavy silence of a family watching the collapse of the empire they had tried to fabricate. At my request, the untouched food and flowers were packed and delivered to community centers around Savannah. The energy in the ballroom softened after that, as if redirecting the remnants of a broken night towards something that might matter. A week later, Harper showed up at 5 a.m. in her housekeeping uniform. She didn't see me watching from the far end of the hallway, and I didn't interrupt. Growth belongs to the one doing the work, not the one observing it. The final image of the night stays with me standing in my office at sunrise, watching the river carry its steady current through Savannah. It reminded me that truth doesn't exist to ruin people. It exists to clear the path so they can rise without the weight of pretending. And as the light touched the city, I knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was the start of a different chapter for Harper and for me. Standing in that quiet executive office with the sunrise spilling across the Savannah River, I realized something I hadn't been able to name before. For years I thought strength meant carrying everything alone: my success, my scars, my disappointments, even the love I still had for people who didn't always know how to love me back. I thought silence kept the peace. But watching Harper take her first steps into a life built on honesty instead of performance made me understand that protecting someone doesn't mean hiding the truth from them. It means giving them the chance to rise with it. That night changed all of us. It stripped away masks, illusions, and every convenient lie we'd leaned on to survive. It forced us to look directly at the things we pretended not to see: the fear behind Harper's choices, the hunger behind the Whitmore's schemes, the ache behind my own quiet distance. And maybe that's why the air felt different the next morning, cleaner somehow, like the city itself had exhaled after holding tension for too long. As for me, I walked the halls of the Blue Monarch with a different kind of certainty. Not the confidence that comes from owning a building or leading a company, but the certainty that comes from watching the people you care about finally choose themselves. Harper didn't just walk into housekeeping at 5 a.m. She walked into accountability, humility, and a chance to rebuild her life without the weight of pretending to be worthy. Watching her scrub down that hallway, hair tied back, uniform crisp, I didn't feel pride or pity. I felt hope. Because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that set you free. And sometimes family isn't about being perfect for each other, it's about learning to grow beside the people you once disappointed. If you're still here with me, listening, reflecting, I want to thank you. Stories like this aren't easy to tell, not because of the shame they hold, but because of the honesty they require. And in a world where so much of our worth is measured by surfaces, it means something when someone chooses to stay for the substance underneath. Before we close this chapter together, I'd love to know you're still here with me. Say I'm here in the comments, or tell me where you're listening from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories reach and how many of you find pieces of your own life tucked between the lines. Maybe you've lived through something similar. Maybe you're facing your own version of a truth that needs to come to light. Either way, you're not alone. And if this story made you feel anything, anger, empathy, recognition, relief, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. Not for numbers, but because every story I share comes from a place I once kept locked away, and knowing someone out there relates makes the telling worth it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. And wherever you are tonight, I hope you find the courage to face your own truth the way we had to face ours, one hard, honest moment at a time.